Hello and welcome to the Nomiki Show. I am Nomiki Const. Let's talk about culpability and accountability and why it is essential to impeach Donald J. Trump and try him in the Senate, even though he will surely be out of office before a verdict is reached. Let's start with some basic points. Donald Trump, the president of the United States, engineered a myth that the 2020 presidential election had been stolen from him. The classic big lie of fascists. He used the power of his office, our office actually, in attempts to intimidate public officials into supporting this myth. These officials included legislative leaders who he summoned from Michigan to the White House, the United States attorney in Atlanta, whom he fired, and of course the Secretary of State in Georgia, whom he asked to, quote, find enough votes to reverse Joe Biden's victory. None of this worked. So the president mobilized his followers to rally near the White House on January 6th, the day Congress would tabulate the electoral votes and certify Joe Biden's victory. At that rally, he told the crowd to march on the Capitol and fight for their country. And you know what happened then. 4 of the marauders and a police officer died in the violence at and inside the Capitol. In a disaster as bad as this, the first question is whether the person at the top, the commander, the corporate CEO, the president of the United States, broke the law. That is a good question here, but the answer is a maybe. And on one of the most important legal questions we as progressives may not even want Trump to be found guilty of, although it sure requires some long-range vision to stick to that. Trump created this mob and sent them to the Capitol. The phrase inciting a riot has been used widely, but could he actually be convicted of that? Here is the dilemma. The Supreme Court has created a very stringent test for declaring that political speech is a crime. Did Donald Trump cross that line? Legal experts say it will be a very tough case to make. And as progressives here, this is our dilemma. We want political speech to be as free as possible. Convicting Trump of inciting the mob would further our short-run fury, but at the very least risk of narrowing the definition of free political speech. That could come back eventually to haunt us, and we see that debate. There is a better solution, though. After the Civil War, the Constitution was amended to say that anyone who had taken the oath of office to, quote, support the Constitution of the United States, end quote, and then in violation of that oath, quote, engaged in insurrection or rebellion, was barred from holding office again. This was written to keep the rebel Southerners from returning to power. But it certainly applies here to Donald Trump. He worked for months to undermine an American election, which is a pretty solid case study of sedition for the modern age, using the tools of democracy to destroy it from the inside. The impeachment resolution the House plans to take up tomorrow morning specifically cites the language I just quoted from the 14th Amendment, which was adopted in 1868. Here is the point. It would be harder to convict Trump or any other citizen under the Supreme Court's rule on political speech. Very hard, stringent. But it is a no-brainer to charge Donald Trump for violating his oath of office by a series of actions and speech that resulted in a mob ransacking the Capitol and bludgeoning people to death. 5 people. He didn't just violate his oath. He trashed it, and we all know it. Republicans know it. The most important penalty of being impeached and convicted is not losing a few days in office, but losing the right to ever hold office again, especially since he's not term limited. So it really doesn't matter whether the Senate reaches a verdict before Trump leaves office. Now, it won't be easy to convict him. It will require 17 Republicans to vote with 50 Democrats now elected to the Senate. But that vote is the second reason to impeach him. We need to have this vote. There are plenty of issues on which we can hold different points of view and still be part of one community of Americans. But this is not one of those issues. It is unacceptable for any American president or any senator or member of Congress to engage in a plot to overthrow an American election, literally by storming Congress and inciting folks who threatened to kill the vice president. to get it done. We need to draw that line, and the Republican Party needs to decide which side it is on. The Republicans love to paint the left as un-American. Well, the sacking of the Capitol to disrupt the electoral vote count is as un-American as it gets, undemocratic as it gets. It is pathetic the way some Republicans are arguing that impeachment will divide the country. We are divided. When have we not been divided? We just had mobs storm the Capitol. If you don't think this is division, you're worried about more division, or are you worried about getting reelected with the Trump base, that crazy Trump base? The only way to reunite us is to be clear on what we believe and hold accountable those who violate that consensus, starting with Donald Trump. Now, Nancy Pelosi has given Vice President Pence until tomorrow morning to implement another constitutional amendment, the 25th, to relieve Trump of office and take over as acting president until Joe Biden is sworn in next week, just next week. That would get Trump's finger off the nuclear button, which, since his Twitter account was taken away, is probably the scariest tech he still has control over. We need to control his impulses. So it is hard to be against removing Trump, but impeaching him and bringing him to trial is far better than removing him under the 25th Amendment. The problem isn't that Donald Trump was unfit from day one to be president. The problem is that an entire political party enabled him in undermining our democratic norms, ripping apart institutions that are there to protect the democratic norms and whatever good rights we have. A Senate vote on Trump's guilt will force Republicans to face their own culpability. That is what is key. We have a great show for you today. Stick around. We'll be right back. We're going to talk a little bit about money laundering. Money laundering. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Hear me?
Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. So as much as the news has been crazy, there are other key issues that we have to be dealing with, obviously, as we go into the Biden administration. Our first guest, I should say, is a former candidate for Congress in New Jersey's 8th District. He is an anti-money laundering specialist, which just brings up a whole slew of issues, even related to Trump, which I think that post-office, especially if we go through this impeachment form, we're going to be exploring just how the office of the presidency was used to benefit him and his family, and of course, any sort of cronies. Hector Oseguera is here to join us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on. It's a real pleasure.
So, you ran for office recently. This is it was a very crazy year to run for office. Let's just start off with what inspired you to run for Congress, given your background.
I mean, really, what inspired me to run is that I live in one of the bluest districts in one of the bluest states in the country. And so for a long time, I was your regular Democratic voter thinking that, even if Congress is messed up, at least I'm doing my part in sending the right people to Congress. 2016 comes, I was always sort of interested in politics, but never saw myself as a participant in politics. And 2016 obviously happens, and the world is sort of a very different place. So I start to re-examine what are the decisions that I made that may have led here? What's sort of going on here at home that may need my attention? And, I come to find out a lot of the elected officials that are being elected in Hudson County, New Jersey, are essentially Republicans with a blue D next to their name. And I started sort of saying, if nobody is going to step up to challenge these people and to challenge the narrative that they're selling to my friends and neighbors, I can be someone who can do that. And given that nobody primaried my opponent in 2018, I thought that it would be a real shame if 2020 were to go by and the progressive movement didn't have a chance to speak on what's going on here in this district, which encompasses many very important cities in the nation: Jersey City, Newark, and Elizabeth, New Jersey, just being three of them. And I felt that we deserved better. So that's what inspired me to get involved.
Your background's in assessing, and I mean, you're a lawyer, you anti money laundering, which is extremely complicated. I mean, following the money often is how you get to the root of corruption, but money laundering is like on a whole other level. Being able to assess how money moves, and especially with the current state of technology, whether it's a cryptocurrency or other forms. It's very hard to crack down on corruption. But I want to start off with just something that's in the news right now. The Treasury Department has this list you mentioned called the 314B. And I'm curious how that relates to the insurrectionist events of last week.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. So, as part of the Patriot Act, which I'm sure your viewers will recognize, there was this law put into place, which is 314B, which you mentioned. It's a list that the Treasury Department sends out to every bank in the United States, which essentially means in the world. And it's a list of people. And if you are banking with these people, you have to stop. And then you have to report to the government how much money they have in your banks and what they've been doing with that money. I remember after so these lists are confidential. You're not allowed, for obvious reasons, you're not allowed to know who's on it and who's not on it. But I can tell you that after certain prominent terrorist attacks, when I was working at certain financial institutions, we would get these lists and I would recognize the names on the lists. And so
they were famous names, or
essentially they were names that you'd see in the news as terrorists or individuals who had carried out certain attacks. I'm sure you'll remember the Pulse nightclub, the Las Vegas attack, all these incidents, and the government would want to know where these people had used the money that purchased the weapons to commit these attacks, is one way of thinking about it. And so I would not be surprised if one of the future lists has names that will never be published in the media and people won't know about, but were people who the government knows were participating in the insurrections, because these lists come out for terrorism very regularly. And I could easily see the attack on the Capitol being seen as a terrorist attack and the government wanting to know who funded these attacks.
I mean, it already seems like it's going in that direction. I mean, people are concerned that, rightfully so, that by deeming this a terrorist attack, it's going to give the government the I guess the political will, maybe that's it, to expand on their already extremely, like the Patriot Act's overextension of power and monitoring folks and surveillance. I don't know how much more you could survey people at this point without going towards the Chinese government, which has expanded their surveillance to whole other levels in the last few years. But I'm curious, like, this makes sense to me, understanding where the money is flowing from, how folks are able to get, weaponry, although it seems like a lot of these folks were individuals who may have, I mean, I'm just making an assessment from my observations, but they may just be folks who like collect guns and could very well do it legally, by the way. So I mean, like at what point is this just prying into people's, I mean, where are you going to get anything from? I mean, it's not like there's a terrorist cell. We know where right-wing extremism comes from. It's not like it's from some overseas group that is trying to funnel money into other groups, and the way that it traditionally works when you look at these cases.
Indeed.
These are just like gun enthusiasts who are totally nuts and reading extremist just organizing in their QAnon forums.
Indeed, but I would push back and say, what's the difference between people on those forums and people who are radicalized by extremists for any cause and are told to, go out and commit acts of violence in furtherance of this cause? This could be very easily seen to mirror that. The only advantage I would say is, like you said, these guys are not they did not send their best terrorists, as you might say, and these people.
Oh, you mean the paint didn't give that away? The fur hats and the paint and stealing and putting the podium on eBay didn't give that away.
Indeed. So it might not be as difficult as it might normally be to crack down on the terror cells, because these guys were not the most sophisticated of terrorist actors. And you're right. Look, I always push back against the government wanting any more authority, because from the inside, as somebody who does this, trust me, they have plenty of authority as it is. So any push to create new laws that extend the surveillance state, I would be completely against and incredibly skeptical of, because I can guarantee you they have enough already to track down a significant portion of the people who were there and the ones who planned it.
And they already have. I mean, they're already arresting people, holding them right now. And obviously the platforms are either being shut down or being taken off of servers, et cetera. I think what's so frustrating to so many Americans is just that the FBI was fully aware of what was underway. And because my take is partly because there's bias in this country, and there's the buffer of the president, and maybe folks didn't take it as seriously when they should have. I mean, given the fact that they almost kidnapped the governor of Michigan. I mean, this is the writing was on the wall. There's a video that we did 2 months ago. Someone shared it online. They said, we called it 2 months ago. And I'm not saying that we called it 2 months ago, but it was after they tried to seize Governor Whitmer and, armed organic militias, right? These are just like folks organizing on their own with no directive from some sort of, top-down leadership. We knew then. And I watched this video and I was like, oh my God, this is 2 months ago. And they weren't prepared. So I guess what's really weird to me is, if it's happening in this more organic way, and there's not a head to cut off, how does the money tracking really make a difference?
I would say that money is the ultimate source of so many of the issues that are plaguing us in so many different political spheres. I love the work that I do, and it's something that I think is something I took to, because that's exactly what I'm doing, is I'm trying to find, where did this all come from? And in the society where we live in, the source of so many things is money, right? I don't put away the idea that there may have been funding from these larger right-wing groups. You could think of so many of them, right. Your wannabe campus right-wingers, people like Milo in a new stage, in a new form, people who recognize that putting fascism in a shiny suit might be a way of selling it to working class, middle of the road people who think of themselves in that sort of way. So I don't discard the idea that there might be well-funded right-wingers behind a lot of what happened and is still happening right now.
I mean, they're definitely funding places like Parler. They're definitely funding. I mean, Ben Shapiro said that he and his campus organization, not Ben Shapiro, the other one, I can't think of his name right now. They brought in buses of college students, but of course, they didn't go that far. They pulled them away after the rally and didn't storm the Capitol. But there are definitely aspects that are clearly funded and sponsored. And maybe that's just enough. They know that they can just tease it out there and it'll grow, and doesn't need directives. It's folks who have been planning for this their entire lives. They are fearful that the government's going to overstep their powers, and this is our government. And I mean, you heard the rhetoric that they were saying. I mean, these are the people who line up at the border, uh, and call themselves militiamen.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's a strain of American politics that goes back a long, long way that looks like that. That's always looking for a big brother to try to come and take our guns and our Bibles and make us submit to communism. And that goes back so far that we're sort of dealing with the newest iteration of that. It's like cosplaying conspiracy theory where, like you said, they don't need too much directive because they'll just make it up as they go along. And then whatever happens confirms what they already think, no matter what happens. And it's such a dangerous, like, cultural cesspool that's being created. I sometimes do work, don't get me wrong, I think deplatforming fascists is a great thing, but I worry about where they turn to that we might not see what they're doing. And they may come back in a more dangerous fashion, and we never even saw it coming because they've been pushed into this dark corner. So there's such a funny way that the digital age meshes with that strain in American politics that goes back all the way to the founding. And I don't have all the answers, but I do think that making sure that we're keeping a wrangle on who's funding these operations is definitely one way of making sure that we're getting ahead of whatever may be coming.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, the ultimate goal with deplatforming right now, fascists and people organizing, is that they want to minimize. They want to band-aid the bleeding. They want to suture the bleeding right now. Months down the line, years down the line, there may very well be a different platform. But I think that's why it's really important that our law enforcement agencies that do monitor this stuff, first off, that they're actually monitoring it and that they're doing something about it, because it's not like it was a secret. I mean, how many of these situations it's come out that the names have been on lists, they've been aware of these folks, and they just don't do anything, partly because sometimes the law enforcement sympathizes with it. Not sometimes, oftentimes.
And are part of these groups.
And specifically part of these groups. Let's pivot real quick because, Trump is leaving office no matter what, no matter what he thinks, on the 20th. And Trump, before his presidency, was no stranger to moving money in many curious ways, and there are some folks who have arguments that he ran for president to basically protect himself from money laundering that he had potentially done overseas. So I'm very curious, like, what is real right now? What forget about impeachment, but post office, what could potentially be investigated that we know for sure, given the last few years of his presidency, that could be investigated in terms of the money laundering?
Yeah, and thanks for that question, because it's a great question. There is a part of the Constitution that we sort of skipped over in law school, and they said, no, this has never been litigated, and nobody would ever be stupid enough to try to do something in contrast to this. So let's just forget about it. Obviously, we're talking about the emoluments clause, a little known provision that basically said you're not allowed to take foreign money while you're the president. Or I think that will be very heavily litigated at this point, because Donald Trump exploited the fact that this anti-corruption clause had never been litigated. No court had ever heard a case on this, because essentially for 200 years, people had taken for granted that nobody would be stupid enough to do something so corrupt, right? let's talk about real estate, which is the industry from which Donald Trump springs. And let's talk about New York City in particular in the 70s and 80s, which was a hotbed of mafia activity. Um, People know about the construction industry and the concrete industry in New York City was for many, many years run by mafia operators. And no project, they often brag that no project could be approved in New York City without the mafia getting a cut of that project. Lo and behold, what industry does Donald Trump come out of is the real estate industry in New York City. Um, the real estate industry is particularly a hotbed of money laundering because a lot of people have high priced assets that people sometimes buy in all cash, right? So who's going to buy a $1 million condo in all cash, right? Obviously, somebody who is obviously not in a legit business. Um, those are not things you see in the normal world. And so Donald Trump builds these buildings, and many of those apartments are sold to Russian oligarchs, people, the world's most unsavory people, because they know that they can park their money in New York City. It's an asset that will appreciate in value, and later on they can walk away from it. And money laundering loves real estate, loves tangible assets because they usually cost so much that people can't really say one way or the other if that's legit. And then who's going to really account for who gets the money at the end of the day? So boats, planes, real estate, all that sort of stuff, cars, money launderers love that stuff because it's just a solid piece of asset that you could sell to anyone for whatever price you really want. And, as long as the other person agrees to pay that price, that's why money laundering is this thing that needs, it's not like a robbery or killing that only one person commits the crime. You sort of need two people to participate in the activity. Some people don't know about it. And that's what people like Donald Trump take advantage of, is that so many people could say, well, how would he know where the money came from? But when you're taking all this money from all these shady characters, sometimes that people are just looking away willingly.
Yeah, I mean, I ran for public advocate of New York in 2018, and it was a big part of my campaign was taking on real estate developers because uh, the lawmakers in New York City, in particular, but really, I mean, this is a crisis that's happening in Miami, it's happening in Chicago, it's happening in DC, it's happening in San Francisco, it's happening in London, it's happening in a lot of these major metropolitan, cosmopolitan, excuse me, cities where folks can safely park their money instead of putting it in banks, as you say, where there are more and more regulations. I mean, the Obama administration really exercised that in terms of cracking down on folks parking their money in overseas Swiss banks, et cetera. So, I mean, in New York, it became extremely frustrating because the cost of real estate is simultaneously going up. So if and I don't know what the number is now, but I think it was like 1 out of 4 pieces of real estate at the time were being sold to foreign oligarchs of some sort. And that undoubtedly has an effect on the market, whether it's the cost of the rent, the tax dollars not going into public services because developers get huge tax breaks, or just changing the neighborhood. Because if you have the incentive to build more buildings, these high-rise towers, it changes the neighborhood. It makes it so that the storefronts, the cost of the small business storefronts, their rents go up. And so you can only afford to have Chase banks and fancy like green juice stores that are, whatever they're doing there. And so it just changes the way that New York has, and it's visible, it's obvious, and it's essentially like empty glass towers everywhere with no lights on. And working people have been moving. I mean, I remember interviewing some union members that are New Yorkers who said they moved outside of Philadelphia and they commute every day in to New York. They consider themselves New Yorkers.